And we're back. And to my guest for yet another week, welcome.
Thank you for having me back again.
We've talked about the lottery issue that you've brought up and why you didn't know how to justify certain Christian or Islamic understandings to God. And you've outlined your belief and given a defense against some objections that I raised against it. But let me ask you, if it is like you think, if God really does exist, then why do you think so many educated people disagree with you?
I think it might have a lot to do with Roman culture. Personally, I suspect the early history of Rome was not as I've read.
Would you mind explaining your suspicion there?
Not at all. But it is highly speculative. And I hope, if it is wrong, that your listeners don't let that influence their evaluation of the influence and fine-tuning of the experience issues that I mentioned in our discussion about my belief. Because that would be like throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
You don't sound that confident in what you're going to say.
It's just that I'm concerned about the truth and want people to distinguish between the speculations that I mention and the issues that I raise.
Well, go ahead. What's your speculation?
I wouldn't be surprised if around 280 BCE, give or take a decade, Gallic tribes gathered together to conquer new land, the plan being to conquer a large amount of territory to the east, including the Italian peninsula and Greece. That the horde initially gathered south of the Alps in what is now northern Italy, before splitting into two, with one part pushing east into what is modern-day Slovakia, as well as western Hungary and southern Austria, and the other part pushing into the Italian peninsula. After the force that had gone further east had conquered those areas, they camped, and waited for the majority of the group that had gone to conquer the peninsular to rejoin them. And the division that had gone into the peninsular did conquer it, and rejoined the other division, leaving only enough men in the peninsular to guard and control those enslaved, and to handle any minor disturbances that might arise. Now, just to be clear, that is not how the history books have it. In the history books, Rome had been a republic for hundreds of years by that time, and the horde didn't go down into the peninsular. But in my speculation, they did. And apart from the gain of territory, it allowed them to concentrate their full force in their eastwards push without having to guard against attacks from the peninsular. Their ultimate aim was to conquer Hellenistic Greece. I'm speculating that not only were reports coming to Athens about the Gauls pushing closer to areas such as Macedonia and Thrace to the north, but Athenian traders were returning from the Italian peninsula and reporting about the invasion that had taken place there. As I understand it, Greece also had a trading settlement in what is modern-day Marseille in France, and I'm speculating that reports were coming back from there about the horde's intention. I imagine in response, reconnaissance ships were sent out to land small groups on the coastal regions to scout the situation, and that reports came back indicating that the peninsular had been quickly conquered. The size of the invading horde's army overwhelming each of the tribes in the peninsular. But as I said, after the takeover, the majority of the horde in the peninsular were heading back up north to join the rest of the horde, which the Athenians took as indicating that there was indeed likely to be a big push towards Greece. A push big enough to be an existential threat for Athens and the other Greek states. And I'll just quickly mention the situation I'm imagining in Athens around the time, just to give some context. About 120 years earlier, the Greek philosopher Socrates had been sentenced to death and made to drink hemlock for, in part, failing to acknowledge the state gods and encouraging the youth to have a similar outlook. Anyway, about 20 years after that, so about 100 years prior to this invasion, Socrates' student Plato wrote a work which became known as the Republic. In it, Plato had Socrates as the main character putting forward the idea of creating a new society and fabricating a myth to serve as its history. And less than 50 years previous to the invasion, Alexander of Macedon had died after conquering a great swathe of land to the east, which he achieved, at least partly, by having a professional army and recruiting men as he conquered. And at the time the horde of Gauls were moving, there was a philosopher named Epicurus teaching in Athens. And I imagine his thoughts were gaining traction amongst many Athenians. Epicurus wasn't openly denying the existence of the state gods, but he was claiming that the gods didn't care what humans did, which I am imagining caused social tension with the more traditional Athenians. The problem the priests had is that no matter how much they prayed, no matter what sacrifices they made, the result never amounted to so much as a pebble levitating. And in this speculation, it was the threat of the Celtic horde that led to a plan being put forward by the Epicureans. The plan was to invade the peninsula and recruit from the people they freed, and in doing so take the peninsula and head north to threaten the Celtic horde from the peninsula, This in turn would force the horde to withdraw forces from the army it had been threatening to conquer the Greek states with, and therefore increase the chance of the Greek states being able to defend. If they were successful, the Epicureans would form a new society towards the north of the peninsula, which would discourage the Gauls from trying to push further eastwards by opening up the peninsular front. While costly in terms of boats, the plan had merit. It could help save Athens, while at the same time get rid of the unwanted influence of the Epicurean contingent that no longer shared the same cultural values as the more traditional Athenians. Thus, the force of Epicureans were given boats, and invaded the peninsula from the sea, and went about freeing the slaves as they started heading north up the peninsula. But unfortunately for them, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were those amongst the freed religious leaders from the city of Tarentum that knew of Epicurus, and the trouble his ideas had caused in Athens. Ideas which were opposed to their way of thinking, and they understood that their liberators were Epicureans. In reaction, they sent emissaries to Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, Epirus being a kingdom opposite modern-day Corfu. Pyrrhus knew the Gauls could be descending upon him, but the emissaries presented him with a plan which not only involved him conquering much of the peninsula, but being able to return with an army larger than that which he sent, with which he could defend his kingdom.
Why couldn't the Athenian priests have approached Pyrrhus?
They could have. If he was approached, maybe it was them. But I doubt the Athenian priests wanted the Epicureans' plan to fail. They both wanted them out of Athens, and to help protect against the Gauls. As I indicated, this is only a very speculative sketch. I wouldn't expect the details to be correct, and I wouldn't be shocked if even the essence was wrong. The reason I am mentioning the speculation at all is because it raises the possibility that the Rome that went on to become an empire was in a sense founded by Epicureans, who, if not atheists, were pretty similar, in the sense that both groups believe that what people do in this room, so to speak, isn't of any concern to any gods.
I just wondered why you specifically mentioned Tarentum.
Well, there was a Greek historian named Polybius. He wasn't exactly impartial in the sense that, from what I have read, in 167 BCE, he was taken hostage by the Romans and detained for 17 years. But because of his education, he became a tutor of the sons of a two-time consul and general. And one of these sons later became a general and patron of Polybius. Anyway, Polybius created a work known as the Histories of Polybius, consisting of several books. And in Book 1, he states that the Tarentines asked Pyrrhus for help, though he doesn't say it was because of Athenian Epicureans or even Gauls. He writes that it was because the Tarentines had insulted Roman envoys.
So in his account, Rome already exists?
Yes, but I am speculating that is because the agreed-upon fabricated history had already been established, and Polybius indicates that Timaeus had already written about it, and indicates that he intended his work to start from where Timaeus had finished. In Book 12, he makes it clear that Timaeus, who wrote an account of the Romans' conflict with Pyrrhus, had also covered how Rome came to be, and indicates that in that account, the story was that Rome had been established by Trojan survivors from the Battle of Troy. And in Section 3 of Book 12, he derides Timaeus' suggestion that Romans commemorate the disaster of Troy by shooting a war horse on a certain day, because the capture of Troy was due to the wooden horse. And just to make it clear to your listeners, I'm speculating that Timaeus wasn't unbiased either. In the speculation, he was writing in Athens, at a time when the founding legend of the Roman group would have been agreed upon with Athens. If it hadn't been agreed before the Epicureans set off, then I'm speculating that it would have been agreed shortly after they had established themselves and overcome Pyrrhus. Neither group feeling that the truth of what happened would be conducive to the harmony of either society. Anyway, I'm speculating that in the summary of events that happened before his intended starting point, Polybius was pretty much just going along with what Timaeus wrote. He reports that Rome had been pretty much taken over by the Gauls in about 400 BCE, that they made peace with the Gauls, and then went on to attack their neighbors and expand throughout Italy. And that after that expansion, the Tarentines had insulted Roman envoys and then, fearing the consequences, had begged Pyrrhus for help. But Polybius adds a seemingly unrelated detail. He mentions that the Tarentines asked for Pyrrhus's help the year before the expedition of the Gauls, who were defeated at Delphi. And considering the bigger picture, it would seem strange for Pyrrhus to risk having his forces diminished in a war, while a horde was amassing to the north of him and might be coming his way.
But in your alternative account, that is exactly what you're suggesting he did, isn't it? That despite the possible imminent invasion, he sailed an army over to the Italian peninsula,
But in the alternative account, the situation was different. There were people to be freed. Pyrrhus would be hoping his army would get bigger, not smaller. Plus, he would be gaining new territory. Not just risking his men to help some city-state because they asked.
Still a bit of a gamble.
A gamble that I assume didn't pay off as well as he'd hoped. And regarding the Tarentines, it wasn't just Polybius that mentioned them requesting help from Pyrrhus. As I understand it, Titus Livius, also known as Livy, wrote a work around the 1st century BCE, which is called From the Founding of the City, and is commonly known as History of Rome. In it seems Livy also stated that Pyrrhus came to aid the Tarentines. I say seems, because Book 12 of Livy's work no longer exists in full. Instead, I've had to go off a summary of what he wrote, which is known as the Perioke. The summaries of books 12 to 14 seem to suggest that Pyrrhus was fighting in Italy and Sicily from before the Gauls had started to move into Macedonia and Thrace, until after they were defeated while trying to sack Delphi. Which would seem very strange given the huge expedition of the Gauls, and the potential threat to Pyrrhus's kingdom. Though the summaries of Livy's work avoided mentioning the huge expedition by the Gauls around that time at all. I'm speculating that the reason no mention was made of them was an attempt to remove pieces of the jigsaw from the narrative, to make it harder for people to put the pieces together. Anyway, in the alternative account, Pyrrhus came to Italy and faced the Epicureans. But the Epicureans, having arrived before Pyrrhus, had already bolstered their forces, and they sent a part of their force to meet him, while the rest headed north up the peninsula, freeing and recruiting more men as they went. Pyrrhus won the battle, but it was costly, and he knew the forces that had headed north would be bigger by the time he managed to catch up with them. And given the threat the Gauls were potentially posing to Epirus, he chose to recruit what he could from the south and head back to Epirus, leaving only a skeleton force in Italy. Then once the Gauls had been largely defeated and no longer posed a threat to Epirus, he returned to the south of Italy, hoping to expand his region of control. But by that time, the danger had also pretty much passed for the Epicureans, and as Romans they headed south to meet him, eventually turning down Pyrrhus's offer to split Italy between them, and instead taking all of it for themselves.
But if what you are imagining were correct, then there wouldn't be any early historical accounts of Rome.
I'm not sure there are any existing historical accounts of Rome that predate Pyrrhus coming to Italy. Though that might be wrong. I might just not be aware of them. The earliest I've heard claimed is that Hellanicus of Lesbos, who wrote during the 5th century BCE, mentioned Rome, though that claim seems to be based on what was written by Dionysius of Halicarnassus in his work Roman Antiquities. But that claim by Dionysius is made over 200 years after Pyrrhus invaded Italy. My point is that I am not aware of any writing by any author predating Pyrrhus coming to Italy which mentions anything about Rome. And that seems to me to tie in with what I am speculating are fabrications made after Pyrrhus came to Italy.
But in our discussion about Christianity, you speculated that Constantine had forged the works of the founding fathers. Why wouldn't the Epicureans have done something similar?
I think they just overlooked it, and then to cover the lack of works by Roman authors, just included claims about earlier authors having mentioned it. How would people know differently? The works that were supposed to mention it would be made up. But by Constantine's time, the issue would have been well known, which would, in my alternative account, be a reason for Constantine not to have made the same mistake and instead have spent resources on having many supposedly earlier works written. But it isn't just that I'm not aware of any Roman literature before Pyrrhus invaded Italy that I find strange.
You had mentioned that Polybius had written that the Gauls had taken over Rome in about 400 BC. Wouldn't that explain the shortage of Roman literature? That it had been destroyed when the Gauls took Rome.
I can see why such a claim might appear to explain the oddity, but there would still be the issue of Athens. The Orthodox history of Rome suggests that Rome became a republic in 509 BCE, which amazingly just happens to be the year before Athens became a democracy. Athens was a trading city-state, and if they were trading with a city that was a republic, with a system that bore some similarities to their own democracy, I imagine people would have written about the similarities and differences, and those writings would have been in Athens. But while there is existing Greek literature dating to before Pyrrhus invaded Italy, to my knowledge, none of it mentions the existence of a Roman republic.
But there are items with Latin inscriptions dating back to as early as the 7th century BC. How do you explain that?
I think some of those dates might be questionable. But even if they were thought to be genuine, the inscriptions were in Old Latin. And as I understand it, in the 3rd century BCE, around the time of the Celtic invasion I was talking about, Latin underwent a noticeable change, from what is called Old Latin to what is known as Classical Latin. Also, as I understand it, the earliest works of Latin literature referenced are from that same century, and they are translations of Greek literature. I'm not suggesting that Rome didn't exist as a city, or that Latin didn't exist before the Epicureans arrived. I'm just speculating that the Athenian Epicureans took it over around 280 BCE, and it is after their takeover that the Roman Republic was formed and the Roman expansion started. And thus, while I'm not aware of any Greek literature preceding Pyrrhus's invasion mentioning Rome, if there was some, then it wouldn't be at odds with the speculation, though it would if it mentioned a Roman Republic.
What about coins? Are there not Roman coins dated to earlier than the 3rd century BC?
Well, the British Museum has some copper alloy coins which it dates from between 326 BCE and 320 BCE, which were minted in Naples. On one side they have the head of Apollo, and the other side they have a man-headed bull, the flank of which is decorated by a star. And above the man-headed bull is a Greek inscription which states, "Of the Romans." As I understand it, the date of 326 BCE is because that is when, in the Orthodox Roman history, Rome takes over Naples. But in the speculation, the date is actually around 280 BCE, and those coins are amongst the first Roman coins minted by the Epicureans, which is why the inscription is in Greek, because the Athenian Epicureans hadn't yet adopted Latin. As far as I'm aware, those type of coins are the earliest Roman coins ever found. And as I said, they are dated close to the period in question, and the inscriptions are in Greek. The British Museum also has some slightly later silver coins, which it dates from 280 BCE to 276 BCE. One side has the head of Mars wearing a Corinthian helmet, the other the head of a horse, and a Latin inscription of the word Roman. In the speculation, the reason for the difference between the inscriptions is that although the Epicureans were quick to establish Roman culture and adopt Latin, the copper coins with the Greek inscription were before they did, and the silver coins were a few years later after they had. And when establishing the culture, they formed a governing system based upon the Athenian idea, but modified it to allow the Athenian Epicureans added influence. The Athenian Epicureans becoming the Roman patricians, and those freed and amalgamated into their group becoming the Roman plebeians. And the Epicureans were quite happy to incorporate plebeian beliefs into the state mythology, a state mythology that the Epicurean patricians just pretended to believe in. Anyway, that was the speculation. That the Roman Republic wasn't as old as Roman historians such as Livy had suggested. And regarding Livy's The History of Rome, which, as I understand it, would have been written in the late 1st century BCE or early 1st century CE, there exists a perspective which I can imagine might have been absent in histories of other cultures of the time. A perspective I assume was supposed to be instructive to the young readers, and one that I imagine was popular amongst many Epicureans. The perspective that religious practices were invented to manipulate the people. For example, after describing the warlike Romulus, Livy then goes on to describe who he claimed was the second king of Rome, Numa. Livy describes Numa being unlike Romulus, being peaceful and making peace with his neighbors, though Livy states that to prevent the people from becoming idle, Numa tried to get them to perform rituals by invoking the fear of the gods into them, and that in order to claim some supernatural wisdom, Numa pretended to have nocturnal interviews with a nymph who told him the rituals which were the most acceptable to the gods. Livy then went on to state that whereas under Romulus the neighboring nations had thought of Rome as a fortified camp rather than a city, Numa's actions made the neighbors respect Rome so much that they thought it would be sinful to injure a state so entirely devoted to the service of the gods. Livy also goes on to describe the third king and then the fourth king, and of the fourth king, Ancus, he wrote that as Numa had instituted religious observances for times of peace, Ancus handed down ceremonies appropriate for a state of war, that wars might not only be conducted but proclaimed with formality. It seems to me that Livy's history almost serves as a guidebook for the Roman patrician youth, and I think from just those examples, it can be seen how he indicates how religion, even if fake, can serve the state. Even if I am wrong about Epicureans founding the Roman Empire, from what I've read, I do suspect that by the time of Constantine in the 4th century CE, the majority of the descendants of the patricians were Epicureans. As I mentioned in our Christianity discussion, the only complete library of antiquity ever discovered was one buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. And from what I have read, the works include large parts of several books from the work On Nature, which is considered to be one of the main works of Epicurus, as well as works by other early followers of Epicurus. Over 40 roles, for example, have been identified as the work of the later Epicurean philosopher and poet Philodemus. I'm speculating that is because the descendants of the patricians tended to be Epicureans. And consider Emperor Julian, often called Julian the Apostate by Christians, because they believe he was once a Christian, but then became a pagan.
I presume you don't think that Julian was once a Christian.
You're right, in the speculation, I don't. I'm imagining that Constantine, Constantine's sons, and Julian all just viewed religion as a way of controlling the masses. That after the death of Constantine, the empire was divided between Constantine's 3 remaining sons, who then went on to fight each other until there was only one left. Hardly the behavior of true Christians, in my opinion. Anyway, the final one died while at war with Julian. Julian was the son of one of Constantine's stepbrothers that were killed by one or more of Constantine's sons soon after Constantine's death. Julian was presumably spared because he was so young. Constantine's sons thought they could control him, which is why later he was entrusted with being a general, but Julian turned, and before they could meet in battle, Constantine's remaining son was dead. The reason I mention him is that he is reported to have written a play called The Caesars, a comedy sketch in which the Greek gods have a banquet and discuss who, out of a group consisting of a selection of Roman Caesars and Alexander of Macedon, was the greatest leader. The winner in the play was Marcus Aurelius, who, when questioned, stated that he had attempted to model himself on the gods. The reason he was supposed to have won was not because of his military prowess, but because of his wisdom. Constantine is a character in the play, and Julian depicts him following pleasure, and brings up the idea of Constantine making a show of repenting before being forgiven by Jesus, only to do it again and then repent again, and so on. The reason I bring the play up is that I suspect Julian not only wrote the play to suggest he was a philosopher-type emperor, like Marcus Aurelius, but also to reason with his fellow Epicureans, that if they are going to use a made-up religion for the people to follow, it would be better to choose a religion that shaped society in such a way as to develop men such as Marcus Aurelius, Julius Caesar, and Alexander of Macedon.
If I may just interrupt, this speculation does seem to be going on a bit, and neither I nor some of my listeners, I should imagine, are clear on why Roman culture, whatever it was, and whatever its history may have been, should matter.
Because those Epicurean families wouldn't have just gone away. And it seems reasonable to me to think that at least some of those descendants would have helped shape the academic conversations and opinions in certain influential social circles well after the Roman Empire was considered to have fallen. And it is easy to imagine that nothing happened to make them believe in any gods.
Okay, but time has moved on, and scientific discoveries have been made. Are you suggesting that none of these influence the belief amongst people that no gods exist?
No, I'm not. What I am suggesting is that the way people thought about things at the time of the discoveries would influence how they interpreted the discoveries. Take the Greeks themselves, for example. Once they started to explore the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and found no sign of the mythical creatures such as centaurs, cyclopes, or sirens, it wouldn't be surprising if they started to doubt the religious stories that they had been brought up with, and in turn, doubt the idea that the gods existed. Likewise with the belief that the gods interfered in battles. When the Roman Epicureans conquered Greece, it is easy to imagine it would have strengthened their view that if gods did exist, they don't concern themselves with human affairs. Otherwise, how did they manage to defeat those in Athens that had earnestly worshipped the state gods when they themselves didn't? Likewise, when the Roman general Pompey entered the holiest of holies in the temple, and nothing happened. And likewise, whenever they subjugated a population, no matter who the people were, the god or gods that they worshipped never came to help them. The reason I am mentioning all this is to set out how I imagine the perspective of many of the more educated ruling class to have been, and suggest that they may have thought the findings supported their Epicurean ideas more than they supported the contemporary religious ideas. And thus their Epicurean beliefs would have been strengthened. And while I'm going to try to skip through this all quite quickly, which will involve leaving quite a bit out, Hopefully, I will be able to paint a picture where you can understand how many educated people were mistakenly led to the conclusion that God didn't exist. We mentioned the problem of evil argument in our previous discussion, and in the 15th century during the Reformation, with the invention of the printing press, it came back. Among the books being read would have been one of Lactantius's, a writer that I mentioned before in our discussion about Christianity. He had worked for Constantine, and in his book On the Anger of God, he outlined a problem of evil argument which he attributed to Epicurus. Sure, he offered the counter, that you need to experience evil to know good. But personally, I don't think that works. You could have had a lovely upbringing surrounded by good people, and yet still understand the concept of evil. You could have had stories of good versus evil without ever having experienced anyone behaving in an evil fashion. What he had done was introduce the issue and mention Epicurus to people that might have previously been ignorant of his existence, while giving the pretense of countering it. Then there were the 16th and 17th centuries. Up until the 16th century, the main model of the Earth, the Sun, and the planets was the one introduced by Ptolemy over 1,000 years earlier, in which the Moon, the planets, and the Sun rotated around the Earth. But in the 16th century, Nicholas Copernicus produced a model which explained the same phenomena as Ptolemy's, but was mathematically simpler. A key difference was that in his model, the Earth rotated around the Sun, and not the other way around.
And why should that have been concerning?
Because it would seem to be in conflict with the biblical account. One of the points I read about being brought up was that Joshua 10 verses 12 to 13 reports that the sun and the moon were told to stand still above certain locations, and did. But with Copernicus's model, the sun wasn't moving, and if the sun were to appear to stop over a certain location, it would be the Earth that would have stopped moving, not the sun. But there seem to be other issues. For example, in Genesis 1. In my opinion, verses 1 to 5 makes it seem like there was space or an expanse above deep water over which the Spirit of God hovered. And verses 6 and 7 then makes it sound like God made an expanse in the midst of the waters, resulting in waters below the expanse and waters above it. And verse 9 states that the waters below that expanse were then gathered into one place, and dry land appeared, which then was made to sprout vegetation. And while all that might seem to describe a flat earth type account, it seems to me to allow room for a different interpretation. Ptolemy's model has the Earth at the center of the universe, and the further out something is from the center, the higher it could be thought to be. Thus, with Ptolemy's model, the Earth could be thought to be below the Sun, but Jupiter be higher than the Sun, and the stars higher still. With that outlook, the water on Earth could be thought to be below the land, and the Earth itself to be below the finite expanse between the waters, in which the planets and stars existed. And then, above the other planets and stars would be water, such that it could be said that the expanse the stars were in was between two waters, the water on Earth and the water encircling the stars, with a further expanse above the higher water. But with Copernicus's model, the Sun, not the Earth, is at the center. So in what sense can the waters on Earth be thought to be below the expanse? The expanse would seem to reach all the way down to the Sun, which would be below the Earth and the waters on it. The Earth would seem to be in the midst of the expanse. Nevertheless, while some attacked Copernicus's suggestion, the Roman Catholic Church seemed to think it better not to give it the attention of condemnation. And the book wasn't initially included in the index of banned books. After all, it seemed all rather academic. Sure, it was mathematically simpler, but there was no need to believe it just because of that. A person could still believe in Ptolemy's model. But in the early 17th century, that all changed. The telescope was invented. And while Galileo Galilei was not the inventor, he was quick to make a version for himself. And he turned it towards the sky. With Ptolemy's model, Venus was in between the Sun and the Earth. And as the Sun rose, or as the Sun set, Venus would never be more than 50 degrees in front or behind it. When in front, it rose before the Sun and was known as the morning star. When it rose after the Sun, it also set after it, and was known as the evening star. With the naked eye, it just seemed to shine, but when viewed through a telescope, how it was illuminated by the Sun could be seen. In Ptolemy's model, the Sun was always beyond it, and so, from the Earth, only the edges of Venus would ever appear illuminated. The rest would be in shadow, a bit like the crescent moon. Because as I mentioned, Venus was never more than 50 degrees before or after the Sun. which meant that unlike with the moon, there was never a time when Venus could largely be over on one side of the planet Earth, while the sun was largely over the other side. And thus, unlike with the moon, a full moon effect should never be seen when observing Venus from Earth, if Ptolemy's model was correct. But with Copernicus's model, Venus could be within 50 degrees from the sun, and yet be further from the Earth than the sun, which meant there should be points in its orbit where it would no longer appear like a crescent moon, but more like a full moon, with most of what is seen of it being lit up. And sure enough, when viewed through the telescope, it could be seen that it appeared like Copernicus's model suggested. There were times Venus appeared like a full moon. Galileo was well connected, one of his patrons being Cosimo de' Medici, the fourth Grand Duke of Tuscany. And the Medici family was well connected with the Church. 3 of the popes in the 16th century had been from the Medici family, and in the 17th century, about 5 years previous to Galileo publishing his findings, the Pope Leo XI, had also been from the Medici family. And in his book, The Starry Messenger, in which he published his findings, Galileo included an introductory section to Cosimo de' Medici, in which he claimed the fame of the characters of the Roman mythology, after which the stars were named, would not fade until the extinction of those stars themselves. And having seen what he referred to as 4 stars around the planet Jupiter, he suggested them being named the Medicean stars. Galileo might have hoped this would offer himself and his work some protection. Nevertheless, despite his powerful connections, opposition against him began to grow within the Church. And it didn't help when Galileo wrote to his student Castelli, stating that in his view, the Bible was intended to teach moral lessons, not scientific ones. Because Castelli, apparently trying to persuade others to have the same view, circulated copies of the letter, which resulted in Galileo being brought before the Inquisition in 1615, where he was accused of believing that the earth moved, which was considered to go against Joshua 10 verses 12 to 13. His connections may have helped, though, because although his writings were investigated and witnesses interrogated, he was exonerated. But while Galileo was exonerated, the Congregation of the Index, which handled which books were banned, in their judgment on the 5th of March 1616, worded their judgment on the matter quite clearly. They declared that the theory that the earth was in motion and not the sun was both false and opposed to the Holy Scripture, and wanted Copernicus's book to be suspended until correction, and for the work of a Carmelite father who declared that such opinions were not opposed to Holy Scripture to be banned, along with any other work that taught the same. Furthermore, prior to that, on the 26th of February 1616, there was a special injunction which witnessed that Lord Cardinal Bellarmine, in the name of the Pope and the whole congregation of the Holy Office, ordered Galileo to abandon the opinion that the sun stands at the center of the world and that the earth moves, and from that point on to cease to hold, teach, or defend such a view in any way, whether orally or in writing. Otherwise, the Holy Office would start proceedings against him. It also records that Galileo promised to obey. However, it seems that Galileo wasn't totally deterred. In 1632, he published a book which took the form of a dialogue between 3 characters. And while in the preface he stated he was going to show that there could be no experiments which could be done on Earth, which could establish that the Earth moved around the sun, the contents raised the suspicion that Galileo was ridiculing the idea that the Earth remained still. The reaction to it was that Galileo was again called before the Inquisition, and this time the Inquisition found against him, finding that he had been ordered not only not to hold or defend the belief that the Earth orbited the sun, but had also been ordered not to teach such ideas, and the dialogue involved the teaching of such an idea. Just as a side issue, I think that at the time, the birth of Venus picture that the Medici family had would have appeared controversial. Given what was going on with Galileo, it isn't hard to imagine that some people would have thought that Venus represented the planet Venus, and the woman trying to cover it up symbolized the Holy Mother Church, and the 2 trying to prevent it being covered up symbolized those embracing the Renaissance movement.
Wasn't that picture from around the 15th century?
Well, the painting is supposed to be a work by Sandro Botticelli, and Sandro Botticelli died in 1510, which is about 100 years prior to Galileo having his book, The Starry Messenger, published. And from what I've read, people tend to be of the opinion that Sandro Botticelli could have painted it earlier in the 15th century, like you said. And the work is mentioned in a book called Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, which is supposedly written by Giorgio Vasari and published in 1550. And as mentioned, Galileo's Starry Messenger wasn't published until 1610.
Then, though visitors might imagine an intention linking the work to Galileo, it couldn't have been done with that intention, because it was completed over 100 years before he had published his book.
I think couldn't would be a pretty strong word. I'm not sure that Cosimo de' Medici II couldn't have the book Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects printed while making out the book had been published earlier. The book was one printed by the Medici family, after all. Both publications had a dedication to Cosimo de' Medici in it, though supposedly that was Cosimo de' Medici I.
Are you suggesting that the picture and the book you mentioned are forgeries?
I'm just saying that if you were to have visited the Medici residence during the time of the controversy and had never heard about the picture before, it would be easy to imagine an interpretation very different from the orthodox one.
But that would be due to a coincidence and your ignorance of the actual events.
Maybe so, but I don't imagine it would be beyond Cosimo de' Medici's capability to have two editions of a book printed up at a later date, with the idea that two editions would make it seem more believable that the books were published at an earlier date. Nor do I imagine it would be beyond his capability to have a painter paint in the style of Sandro Botticelli. There might have even been painters around that could claim Sandro Botticelli, in their painting lineage, so to speak, that he taught their teacher's teacher's teacher, for example. Also, as I understand it, it used to be thought that the Medicis had that picture and another called Primavera, done as a pair. But that changed in 1975 when a 1499 inventory of the Medici estate was published. While Sandro Botticelli's Primavera was listed, there was no mention of Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus painting. And while Sandro Botticelli didn't die until 1510, it is thought that his large mythological paintings were done in the 1480s, and that after that he moved on to different subject matter.
But it would be a ridiculous amount of work to be undertaken, simply for a picture, would it not?
Well, not for Cosimo de' Medici himself, it would just be a matter of money. And it isn't every day that you get stars named after your family. I say stars, but actually what Galileo named the Medicean stars would have been the moons of Jupiter. But maybe it was the coincidence as you imagine it. Either way, given the issue of the illumination of Venus brought up by Galileo, I can imagine people around that time could have read a different meaning into it. And with that meaning so easily read into it, if it was a coincidence, it was also very handy that they had documents to support the idea of it being done earlier. Otherwise, the church might have got the impression that they were publicly standing against it. Perhaps coincidentally, but after the Starry Messenger publication, as far as I know, there was never another Medici pope. And the moons of Jupiter don't tend to be referred to as the Medicean stars.
Okay, you seem to have slipped in another speculation. Another speculation involving forgery and deception. And with this one, I don't even see how it is particularly relevant.
It isn't. I just thought it might be of interest to your listeners to imagine a different narrative while looking at a familiar painting. And yes, many of my speculations are speculations that there had been forgeries and deceptions, but I don't think such things are implausible. An article on HistoryExtra.com claims that modern scholars have established that over half of the surviving texts in the names of the Merovingian rulers of early medieval France and Germany are fakes, and a third of those in the names of the Lombard rulers of northern Italy are suspect. And similar figures hold true of the nearly 2,000 documents of pre-conquest England. The vast majority of the fakes being forged in the Middle Ages, in most cases between the 10th and 13th centuries, and that many of those responsible for the forgeries were leading figures within the church. The point being that forging documents wasn't so rare that any speculation suggesting it would necessarily be implausible. If that article is correct, then it would seem that the possibility of forgery should at least be considered. And with regard to my speculations, I am clearly labeling them as such, and am not claiming they are correct. Anyway, moving on, because that wasn't it for the 17th century. In 1687, Isaac Newton published his book, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. In it, he outlined mathematical formula for predicting observed motions, and in so doing explained the motion in terms of forces acting on the bodies in motion. He used his mathematical description of the force of gravity to derive the laws of planetary motion, which had been put forward by Johannes Kepler earlier in the century. He also accounted for tides, the trajectories of comets, and other phenomena. These simple laws explained the astronomical phenomena, and effectively eradicated doubt about the sun being at the center of the solar system amongst the scientific community. I'm going to pretty much skip over the 18th century, other than to mention that the Industrial Revolution started in it, and that in his third edition of his book, which was published in 1726 before the start of that revolution, Newton included 4 rules of reasoning which would influence scientific thinking. And the first rule was that we are to admit no more causes of natural things than such as are both true and sufficient to explain their appearances, which raised the question of what appearance of a natural thing required a belief in God. Anyway, on to the 19th century. By this time, there had been an expansion of the knowledge of the sciences. It seemed like a complete picture of physics was near, and the technological advancements in the Industrial Revolution were considered the fruits of science. If knowledge was the goal, then science, rather than philosophy in general, seemed to be the path to follow. And some philosophers came to the idea that philosophy could guide the scientific endeavor. One such philosopher, considered one of the founding fathers of philosophy of science, was the French philosopher Auguste Comte. Comte suggested that human knowledge, in all areas of knowledge, passes through 3 stages, starting off with the theological or fictitious and passing through the metaphysical or abstract, before finally arriving at the scientific or positive. Part of Comte's contribution was to introduce a unity between the sciences, in the method and scope of their investigation. The method involved introducing a hypothesis which allowed for a positive and inevitable verification at a later time, and the scope was restricted to the analysis of phenomena in order to discover their laws. The nature or cause or the mode of production of those laws was out of scope. And I'll come back to this later as it seems extremely influential and can explain some of the intellectual mess that people got themselves into.
Do you mind if I ask you why, if he was so influential, I haven't heard of him? Because I have heard of Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton, but not Comte.
It might be because he was declaring that religion was a fiction, a stage that humans passed through in their development, a stage which was destined to disappear. If you don't mind, I'll just read a couple of extracts of what was written about him. The first is written by Harriet Martineau in the preface to her 2-volume work, in which she freely translated and condensed Comte's 6-volume work in French into 2 volumes in English. Apparently, she did it so well, Comte recommended her work to his students. In the first paragraph of her preface, she wrote, "Seldom as Comte's name is mentioned in England, there is no doubt in the minds of students of his great work that most or all of those who have added substantially to our knowledge for many years past are fully acquainted with it, and are under obligations to it which they would have thankfully acknowledged but for the fear of offending the prejudices of the society in which they live. Whichever way we look over the whole field of science, we see the truths and ideas presented by Comte cropping out from the surface and tacitly recognized as the foundation of all that is systematic in our knowledge." And I'd like to read parts from the first introductory paragraph in the online Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article about him. It is difficult today to appreciate the interest Comte's thought enjoyed a century ago, for it has received almost no notice during the last 5 decades. Before the First World War, Comte's movement was active nearly everywhere in the world. The best-known case is that of Latin America. Brazil and Mexico are 2 prominent examples. The positivists, that is, the followers of Comte, were equally active in England, the United States, and India. And in the case of Turkey, its modern secular character can be traced to Comte's influence on the Young Turks. I read those to give an idea of how influential he was, and why many didn't openly credit him. And while the monument to him seems to be no longer directly in front of Sorbonne University in Paris, it is still in the Place de Sorbonne, which is in front of the university. And France isn't the only country to have featured him on a stamp. A couple of years after the death of Comte, another major influential character in the 19th century, Charles Darwin, gave an evolutionary account of the development of humans in his book On the Origin of Species. The argument was that animals, including humans, had evolved over a period of time, and that the development was more tree-like, in the sense of different evolutionary branches leading to different species, but those branches leading back to common ancestors, which seems to contradict the biblical account in Genesis 2 verses 21 to 23, in which Eve is said to have been made out of one of Adam's ribs. And there were theists that did object to Darwin's evolutionary account on religious grounds. The Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, for example, debated Thomas Huxley at Oxford University regarding the truth of evolution. But it was by no means rejected by all theists. One of the chief advocates for the theory in the United States was Asa Gray, who was a theist. Gray declared the theory of evolution to be compatible with both theism and atheism, and declared that was true of physical theories generally. However, it did provide the atheists with a vague explanation of how life on Earth came to be as it is, and it was an account in which humans were not some specially chosen species, but were merely one of many evolved species. And I suspect it strengthened the opinion of those that agreed with Comte that religion was a fiction which was destined to die out. Now, even just up to here, it's not hard to understand why by the start of the 20th century atheism was starting to become more commonplace, and why followers of Comte's movement, that religion was just a phase humanity was destined to pass through, were widespread in the world. And just before I move on to the 20th century, I should just mention that Comte was also considered to be the forefather of sociology, a social science which includes the study of social change. I mentioned earlier that in the 19th century it seemed like a complete picture of physics was near, but things took a surprising turn in the early 20th century. 20th century physics saw quite dramatic changes in the models used for both the small and the large-scale modeling. On the atomic scale, quantum mechanics emerged which provided a statistical model, and on the astronomy-type scale, there was Einstein's theory of relativity. In our last conversation, we talked about Einstein's theory of relativity when you raised the question of whether it had any implications for free will. And I pointed out that while in Einstein's theory of relativity there was no concept of absolute simultaneity, it doesn't mean that the idea of absolute simultaneity is incompatible with the theory of relativity, while explaining why it wasn't at odds with the idea of us having free will. What I didn't mention at the time, because we hadn't mentioned Comte, is that I think such understanding stems from not understanding Comte's position properly and thinking that science was an investigation into the nature of reality rather than rule-finding. And I think Comte's influence can be seen in both the theory of relativity and in quantum mechanics. Einstein, in his book Relativity, the Special and the General Theory, when discussing the concept of simultaneity, wrote that a concept such as simultaneity does not exist for a physicist until he has the possibility of discovering whether or not it is fulfilled in an actual case. Which ties in with where Comte had said that, with his positivist method, only hypotheses which allowed for a positive and inevitable verification at a future time were allowable. Because that meant with Comte's positivist method, it would have to be possible to tell whether the conditions mentioned in a hypothesis were met. And thus, a conditional concept could not exist for someone following Comte's positivist method unless there was the possibility of discovering whether the conditional concept had been met or not. When defining simultaneity in a way which could be measured, Einstein had indicated that the way it is meant in a theory such as presentism was not scientific, and as such, presentism was not a scientific theory.
Presentism?
The idea that there is a present, a future, and a past, and that all that exists is in the present. Since there is no way for us to measure what events are absolutely simultaneous, the present as it is meant in presentism cannot be scientifically established, which means it becomes a metaphysical concept, and the idea that a concept needed to be testable in order to have meaning in physics shaped the development of physics in the 20th century, and led Heisenberg to develop, in 1925, a mathematical framework for quantum physics that became known as quantum mechanics. Among his leading ideas were that only concepts that could be tested should be included in the framework, and that all attempts to form a picture of what goes on inside the atom should be avoided. The result was a framework that provided statistical outcomes for what the measurements would be, with no causal explanation for why a given result should be as it was measured to be. However, a year later, Edwin Schrödinger put forward a mathematically equivalent account which did offer an explanation of what went on inside the atom. And scientists like Einstein, as I understand it, initially favored Schrödinger's theory because it gave a picture of what was going on inside the atom. And in a letter to Max Born, a physicist who had incorporated Schrödinger's equation into quantum mechanics to give the probability for the outcome of a measurement, Einstein wrote that an inner voice told him that quantum mechanics was not yet the real thing, and that he was convinced that the old one is not playing at dice. It seems to me that Einstein seemed to have a certain metaphysical outlook that he expected to be reflected in the physics, and didn't seem happy with physics models that didn't reflect it. Max Born wrote in his commentary on the letter that he felt Einstein's rejection of quantum mechanics as a final theory was based on a difference in philosophical attitude between Einstein and the younger generation, which Max Born felt he belonged to. The younger generation that Max Born felt he belonged to accepted that restricting physics concepts to those which could be tested meant that physics was no longer an investigation into the nature of reality and was instead restricted to rule-finding. And those such as Born were of the mind that since they wouldn't be able to deliver anything other than statistical rules at the quantum level, quantum mechanics was indeed the final theory. And indeed, Born and another physicist had written a book together in which they wrote that the statistical interpretation of physics was the final one, before removing the statement after being requested to by Einstein. And just to emphasize how the younger generation of physicists felt about it. Apparently, another famous physicist, Niels Bohr, when asked about whether quantum mechanics mirrored the underlying quantum world, answered, "There is no quantum world. There is only an abstract quantum physical description. It is wrong to think that the task of physics is to find out how nature is. Physics concerns what we can say about nature." I think the response reflected an influence of Kant. But since we are discussing the rise of materialism, that is the rise in the belief that all that exists is the material world, it might be worth considering that some people might have been thinking that quantum randomness was further evidence against the existence of God, in the sense that rather than the universe being designed to run like some giant clockwork machine, it was to a certain extent random. And that conception, along with the theory of evolution, could have supported many believing that our human forms were arrived at through chance, rather than by any design. And that wasn't all that happened in the 20th century. The philosopher David Papineau argued in an essay titled The Rise of Physicalism that the main two reasons for the widespread adoption of physicalism in the 20th century were what he called the argument from fundamental forces and the argument from physiology. The argument from fundamental forces was that all forces seemed to reduce to a small set of fundamental forces. And while this seemed to leave the door open for the possibility that forces studied were the only forces in non-living things, by the mid-20th century studies in living things had progressed. There was a better understanding of the organic processes in living bodies, and they all seemed to be accounted for by the fundamental forces. The role and constitution of protein enzymes was recognized, protein structures analyzed, and basic biochemical cycles were identified, as well as DNA. The discovery of DNA supported the evolutionary account, and all the activity could be explained using just the fundamental forces. And this absence of any additional forces being discovered in living things was the basis of the argument from physiology. That detailed physiological investigation failed to uncover evidence of anything except familiar physical forces, made it difficult to go on maintaining that special forces operate inside living bodies. And there was another development in the 20th century that I think may have supported some people's belief that God doesn't exist: the computer. Now, you might wonder why I would say that. The reason is that in 1950, one of the major contributors to the development of the computer, Alan Turing, considered the question, "Can machines think?" in his paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence. And in it, he suggests that if a computer could imitate a person, such that the average investigator, after communicating with it by text for 5 minutes, would be unable to determine whether they were conversing with a machine or human, then, in his opinion, it should be considered to be thinking. Though in that same paper, he initially started out stating that he thought the question, "Can machines think?" was too meaningless to deserve discussion. This claim of meaninglessness was, I assume, connected to the philosopher Wittgenstein's idea that a concept is meaningless unless it can be scientifically tested for. As this idea had been picked up on by an influential philosophical group, later known as the Vienna Circle, that flourished from the 20s up until the 50s, and would explain Turing's strange claim. Turing did, however, go on to state that he believed by the 21st century, general educated opinion will have altered so much that one would be able to speak of machines thinking without expecting to be contradicted. He considered several objections to the idea that machines could think, though I will only mention two. The first was what he called the theological objection, which is that thinking is a function of a man's soul, and since a machine wouldn't have a soul, it wouldn't think. In response to such an objection, Turing raised the possibility that God would give the machine a soul, before going on to state that he didn't consider the theological objection to hold any weight. because such arguments have often been found unsatisfactory in the past. That how, in the time of Galileo, it being stated in Joshua 10 verse 13, that the sun stood still and hasted not to go down about a whole day, and Psalms 104 verse 5 stating that the foundations were laid so that it should not be removed forever, were once considered enough to refute Copernican theory. Though with our present knowledge such arguments appear futile. The other objection he considered was what he called the argument from consciousness, which is roughly that machines don't think because they are not conscious. In response, Turing suggested that the most extreme form of the argument would be that only if one were the machine could one be sure that it thinks, but that with that type of argument, there would be no justification in thinking that anyone else is conscious.
You obviously don't agree with him.
I just think he chose an extreme view which he could counter. But an argument that machines aren't conscious and therefore don't think needn't claim that you'd need to be the machine in order to know whether it experienced. The machine could be controlled by an arrangement of NAND gates, and I could tell that its behavior was not being influenced by the type of conscious experience that it reports having. It was just the logical consequence of the arrangement of NAND gates, the state the arrangement was in, and the inputs it received. As mentioned in our discussion about my belief, I can tell from my experience that at least part of reality is experiencing, which indicates that what I am experiencing is influencing my behavior. And thus, while there would be good reason to reject the idea that the machine was consciously experiencing or thinking, the same justification couldn't be used to reject the idea that other humans were. And if an atheist tried to claim that it was the same for a human as for the robot, that the human's response was just the logical consequence of the arrangement of its biological components, the state the arrangement was in, and the inputs it received, they would just be begging the question regarding that. Because while I can understand that there are no scientifically demonstrable indications of further force is at work within the human form, I can also understand how such an influential force could go undetected. They might respond by saying that I'm begging the question that there is a further force at work. But actually, all I would be doing is justifying why I would reject the idea that the machine was consciously experiencing, and how I could disagree with Turing regarding the machine without having to assume that other humans weren't experiencing. The atheists would be free to believe what they like, though there would still be the influence and the fine-tuning of the experience issues for their belief.
I see. Obviously, you didn't find Turing's argument that we should think of machines as thinking very convincing.
No. But I can understand why, with what had happened historically between the church and science, and with influences such as Auguste Comte and the scientific discoveries, people could have started to doubt the existence of God, and why academics might have been gung-ho in declaring a physicalist reality, as it could have just been considered an educated bet.
But so far in the conversation, you don't seem to have found any of what you've brought up convincing enough to lead you to become an atheist. Yet you are putting it forward as the type of evidence that you think was convincing enough to lead others to become atheists. How do you reconcile that?
What I was trying to do in this conversation is point out what may have seemed to be a conflict between their understanding of God and the evidence. At the time of Copernicus and Galileo, what was being suggested would have been against what the church had been teaching, and therefore against the religious understanding of the majority of Christians at the time. Similarly, with Darwin and the theory of evolution, and it is reasonably easy for a theist to have in their mind a false dichotomy, that either God exists, and it is like their understanding suggests, or God doesn't exist. And then when their understanding is undermined, so is their belief in God. Furthermore, there were experiments done in the 20th century which showed how many people choose to conform to their peers' views, which would...
Sorry for interrupting again. But would you mind just mentioning which experiments you're talking about?
Not at all. They were known as the Asch conformity experiments, though further experiments were done by other people which supported the findings. The Asch experiments tended to be quite simple. One was where there are a group of 8 people in a room, and they are shown 2 cards, one with a single line on it, the reference line, the other with 3 lines, each labeled either A, B, or C. The examiner then asks each of the group in turn, which line, A, B, or C, is equal in length to the reference line. But it wasn't quite what it seemed. Of the group of 8, only one was the subject of the experiment. The others were under instruction to respond to certain card pair questions with incorrect answers. The idea was to measure how the subject who was being studied would behave when faced with a situation in which the rest of the group unanimously contradicted their own judgment. There were 18 questions in all. For the first 2 questions, those in the group working with the examiner gave the correct responses. But for the remaining 16 questions, they gave incorrect responses 12 times. The experiment involved going through this process 50 times, meaning 50 subjects were tested in all. On average, the 50 made about 3.84 mistakes in judgment, whereas in the control group of 37 subjects, where the subjects presumably answered by themselves, the average was 0.08 mistakes. The experiment showed that over 70% of the people in the trial would, at least occasionally, even deny their own senses in order to conform. In another experiment, the situation was pretty much reversed. A single person was instructed to give wrong answers, with the majority being unaware. Ash commented that the majority treated the individual with amusement and disdain, while lacking awareness that they draw their strength from the majority, and that their reactions would change radically if they faced the dissenter individually. Anyway, the point I was going to make was that the experiments showed that there was a tendency for people to conform to peer opinion, and that it wasn't just the number of people holding the opinion that mattered. It was also how much of an authority the person was considered to be on the matter. Which explains how, as the idea began to get traction in academic circles, there started a psychological snowball effect, so to speak. Furthermore, the influence of groups such as the Vienna Circle enabled atheist academics to claim that the concept of God was meaningless, while at the same time, somewhat hypocritically, propagating the idea that we lived in a physical universe. Though Rudolf Carnap, who was a member of the Vienna Circle, was considering it meaningless to consider whether the environmental objects were physical or not.
But what was his justification for claiming such a distinction was meaningless?
Because Carnap was considering whether reality was physical or spiritual to be metaphysical. And he was considering a claim to be metaphysical if it was a claim beyond all experience. Though it seems to me Carnap had been blinkered by Comte's influence. And Comte's idea that a belief in God was simply a primitive stage in intellectual development. Because while the claim that all that exists is spiritual needn't entail a claim of an afterlife, it could do. And if it did, then its claim would not be beyond all experience. Because if you followed the loving, selfless path, for example, and were given the experience of heaven, then perhaps you could be given the experience of being informed whether the environmental objects were physical or were simply held in the mind of God, for example.
Would you agree, though, that scientific discovery has been in line with what one would expect if it was a physical reality, as many atheists believe?
I don't think all the discoveries were as expected if reality had been a physical one. For example, as I mentioned, Einstein was not happy with the statistical model of quantum mechanics being thought of as the final model, seemingly because it didn't fit in with his metaphysical imagining of reality. What I didn't mention was that in 1935 Einstein, along with his colleagues Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen, put forward a paper which concluded that statistical quantum mechanics was incomplete. They suggested that for a theory to be considered complete, every element of physical reality must have a counterpart in the physical theory, and that for every value that can be predicted with certainty without disturbing the system, there exists an element of physical reality corresponding to the predicted physical quantity. And just as a side issue, it seems to me that they had assumed there was a physical reality in their definition of a complete theory, despite there being no scientific test to establish whether there was or wasn't. If I've not misunderstood, then this would seem to place Einstein in a contradictory position, with him being happy to discard there being a present when formulating his theory of relativity, and to claim the concept was meaningless in physics without the possibility of establishing whether an event was in the present, while being happy to hold on to the concept of a physical reality, when there was no possibility by experiment of establishing whether there was or wasn't one. Anyway, Heisenberg had established that when examining certain particles such as electrons, for example, certain pairs of the particle's properties, such as position and momentum, for example, cannot both be known for any given point in time. Because the more accurately you measured one, the more you would disturb the later measurement of the other. This became known as Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And these type of properties are known as non-commutative property pairs. which meant that the result would be different depending on which was measured first. Like in mathematics, where certain operations such as multiplication are commutative, because it doesn't matter which number comes first. 4 multiplied by 2 is the same as 2 multiplied by 4. But other operations such as division are not commutative. 4 divided by 2 is not the same as 2 divided by 4. Anyway, Heisenberg, being of the younger generation of physicists, was of the mind that, because of this, physics models should not consider such properties to exist simultaneously, because there was no possibility of knowing what the values for both of the properties were at any given point in time. In response, Einstein and his colleagues imagined an experiment which made use of the fact that in quantum mechanics, two things can become entangled. And what that means is that the measurement of one of the entangled things, a particle for example, will give you information about what the measurement of what it is entangled with will be. And the way they made use of that was to imagine two particles, both of which had properties P and Q, being entangled with each other such that by measuring property P of one, you would know property P of the other, and likewise by measuring property Q of one, you would know property Q of the other. They then imagined separating the entangled particles, before measuring one and then the other, but doing so close enough in time that light wouldn't have time to travel from the first measurement to the second measurement before the second measurement was done, and assumed that this would mean that the measurement of the first particle couldn't have disturbed the measurement of the second particle, because nothing could travel faster than the speed of light. And they then concluded that since the measurement of property P or Q of particle 1 wouldn't have disturbed the measurement of particle 2, they were able to predict the measurement of particle 2 with certainty, without disturbing it, which they claimed meant that there existed an element of physical reality corresponding to the predicted value. They did consider the objection that their experiment didn't allow for properties to be simultaneously predicted, and that because of that P and Q were not simultaneously real. In response, they claimed that such a claim would be tantamount to claiming that the reality of P and Q depended on a measurement on the first particle which did not disturb the second particle in any way, and argued that no reasonable definition of reality could be expected to permit this. And they concluded that since their thought experiment had, in their opinion, showed that there would exist an element of physical reality corresponding to the predicted values, by showing that those values could be predicted with certainty without disturbing the particle that was to be measured, that it meant that quantum mechanics was incomplete because there wasn't a counterpart in the theory to those elements of physical reality, because the theory only suggested a statistical reality for those properties of the second particle until the first particle was measured. And in a later letter to Max Born in 1947, Einstein stated that although he recognized the validity of the statistical approach, he couldn't seriously believe in it because the theory cannot be reconciled with the idea of physics that should represent a reality in time and space, free from spooky actions at a distance. By which he meant that for the properties of the second particle to have really only had a statistical reality, the measurement of the first particle would have to have influenced the measurement of the second particle, and he was describing such influences as spooky actions at a distance. And I think the idea that physics represented a reality in time and space, free from spooky action at a distance, would have been quite a widespread expectation amongst the atheists at the turn of the 20th century. But in 1964, a physicist named John Stuart Bell showed that what Einstein and his colleagues thought wasn't compatible with what quantum mechanics predicted. That if the physical reality was such that there was no spooky action at a distance, and each particle had a definite value before measurement, which is revealed upon measurement, then the results would not be as quantum mechanics predicted. Consider 3 tests which we can call A, B, and C, each of which can be passed if failed by a particle. Then imagine that the particle has real physical properties which determine how it will react to the tests. For example, the properties might determine that it would fail test A and B but pass test C. There are only 8 combinations of what the particle's reactions to the tests could be, and of those 8, there are only 2 where test A passes but test C fails. Likewise, there are only 2 where test A passes but test B fails, and 2 where test B passes but test C fails. Bell highlighted that when you consider a pair of test results such as test A passing but test C failing, it is noticeable that the combinations indicate that for the combinations that would give that result, either test A passes and test B fails or test B passes and test C fails. Therefore, the probability for either of those happening cannot be less than the probability of test A passing and test C failing. Because in all the combinations where test A passes and test C fails, one of the other two also occurs. And one of the other two can also occur even when it isn't the case that test A passes and test C fails. This gives Bell's inequality that the probability of test A passing and test B failing, plus the probability of test B passing and test C failing, is greater or at least equal to the probability of test A passing and test C failing. And you could test this out just writing out on paper a list of particles, 1, 2, 3, and so on, and write down for each whether it would pass or fail each of the tests, A, B, or C. Then at the end, you can do a tally for how many of the particles in the list would have passed A but failed B, and how many would have passed B but failed C, and how many would have passed A and failed C. And you might think, so what? Well, photons passing through a series of polarizers seem to violate Bell's inequality law, and this can be shown passing light through two polarizers in sequence. The chance of a photon passing through the first polarizer will be 50% or 0.5. In other words, 50% of the light would be expected to pass through, and 50% of it would be blocked. And as such, if you were looking through the polarizer, things would appear darker than if you were to simply look through a clear piece of glass. If you were to hold another polarizer up behind the first, such that the polarizers were orientated in the same direction, then the light would appear to be dimmed to the same extent as it was when looking through the single polarizer. In other words, all the light that made it through the first polarizer would make it through the second polarizer. But if that second polarizer was at a 90-degree angle to the first, then no light would pass through both. When passing the light that has just been through a polarizer through another polarizer, then the amount of light that passes the second polarizer depends on the difference in the orientation of those polarizers. The amount of light blocked will be the sine squared of the angle. In other words, you would take the sine of the angle and then square the result. If the difference is 30 degrees, for example, then since sine 30 is 0.5, squaring the result will give 0.25, meaning that a quarter of the light or 25% of it would be blocked getting through that next filter. So imagine three polarizers, A, B, and C, with B at a 30-degree angle to A and C at a 60-degree angle to A. We could then set up tests, with light passing through the polarizer being considered to pass the test, and light failing to being considered to fail the test. We could set up polarizer A followed by polarizer B and see how much light passes through A but fails to pass through B. We could then set up polarizer B followed by polarizer C and see how much light passes through B but fails to pass through C. And finally set up polarizer A followed by polarizer C to see how much light passes A but fails to pass through C. And we could then check if the amount of light passing A but failing to pass B plus the amount of light passing B but failing to pass C is greater than or equal to the amount of light passing A but failing to pass C. In other words, we can check whether the result violates Bell's inequality theorem. And if we do that, we find that it does. Because the amount of light passing A is 0.5, and the amount of light failing to pass B is 0.25, meaning that of half the light that passed A, a quarter of it failed to pass B. Meaning that 12.5%, or an eighth of the light passed A, but failed to pass B. And the same with the case where the setup is polarizer B before polarizer C, because the amount of light that will pass test B but fail to pass C is based on the difference of angle between the second polarizer and the first. And in both this case and the previous A followed by B setup, the difference in angle of orientation between the first and second polarizer is 30 degrees. So the amount of light that passed A but failed to pass B in the first setup, plus the amount of light that passed B but failed to pass C in the second setup adds up to 25%. But when we look at the third setup, we find 37.5% of the light passes A, but fails to pass C, because while 50% passes A, the difference in angle between A and C is 60 degrees. And when we square the result of sine 60 degrees, it comes to 0.75. But because only 50% managed to pass A, the amount of light that will pass A but fail to pass C will be 37.5%. And thus, with these polarizer setups, we find that the probability of the photons passing A but failing to pass B, plus the probability of passing B but failing to pass C is not greater or equal to the amount of light that passes A but fails to pass C, because 25% is less than 37.5%. But if you remember, I mentioned writing a list of particles on the paper and writing for each whether they pass or fail test A, B, or C. But that, like Bell's inequality theorem, assumes that each particle has a state which determines how it will pass each test, and that the tests themselves don't alter how the particle will behave in one of the other tests. But if we were to use a setup where the second polarizer was at a 90-degree angle to the first, then as I mentioned, while 50% of the light would pass the first polarizer, none of that light would pass the second. Because the amount of light blocked at the second would be sine of 90 degrees, which is 1 squared, meaning that 100% would be blocked. But if we were to place a third polarizer in between those two, and orientate that middle polarizer to 45 degrees to the first, then light would pass through all three. Because 50% would pass the first polarizer, and because the middle polarizer was at 45 degrees to it, and sine 45 degrees when squared is 0.5, 50% of the light that got past the first polarizer gets blocked from going through the second polarizer. But 50% of that light makes it, meaning 25% of the light passed both. Then since the final polarizer is also at a 45-degree angle to the polarizer prior to it, again 50% of the light that made it to it will get blocked, and 50% would get through, which means 12.5% of the light gets through all three filters. Before we added the middle polarizer, no light passed the final polarizer, but when we did, light managed to pass. And from that we can tell that the polarizers had altered the state of some of the light particles, the photons, enough to allow them to pass the final filter. Which explains how the tests managed to violate Bell's inequality theorem. The tests were altering the properties of the particles. Okay, where's all this going, you might wonder? Well, it has to do with the thought experiment imagined by Einstein and his colleagues. Instead of passing photons through one polarizer and then another, the idea would be to test entangled pairs of photons. The test pairs would be entangled, then separated, and each would be passed through a different polarizer, one hitting its polarizer first. If the polarizers are orientated in the same direction, then either they both get through or they both fail to. And if the second polarizer is at a 90-degree angle to the first, then one photon will pass, and the other will fail to, which allows for it to be tested whether they are entangled correctly or not. And the polarizers can be far enough apart that light wouldn't have had time to travel from the first measurement to the second measurement before the second measurement was taken, and as I understand it, the results were the same as when passing light through one polarizer and then another, with Bell's inequality being violated. This was found simply by varying the orientation of the polarizers each photon passed through, so that the probability for each test pair could be established, which seems to be the type of effect that Einstein had characterized as spooky action at a distance. Because the measurement of the second photon seemed influenced by the angle of its polarizer compared to the angle of the polarizer, the first photon was passed through. Even though Einstein and his colleagues had suggested that the first measurement wouldn't disturb the second. Incidentally, Nobel Prizes for Physics were handed out in 2022 for experiments with entangled photons, establishing the violation of Bell inequalities and pioneering quantum information science.
Are you saying that spooky action at a distance has been established?
No, because although Einstein wrote in 1947 that the statistical approach, as a complete theory, couldn't be reconciled with the idea that physics should represent a reality in time and space, free from spooky action at a distance. About a decade later, Hugh Everett did come up with an interpretation which does, in a way, reconcile it. It is known as the multiple world interpretation. There are lots of different interpretations, but an example of how it can avoid spooky action at a distance is that, as I understand it, it can be interpreted as roughly suggesting that in an experiment where entangled particles are separated, each gets through the polarizer in one world and then fails to get through the polarizer in another. And in a case where one polarizer was at 90 degrees to the other, the world in which the photon passes one polarizer will marry up, so to speak, with the world in which the photon didn't get past the other. One issue with such interpretations is how they explain why we observe the probabilities we do at all. It seems to me, though I may have misunderstood, that one way of getting past the issue is to simply claim that there are an infinite set of worlds, and that at each branching the probability reflects the proportion of worlds that each event happens in that branching. In the example where the light is shown through that second polarizer, which was a 30-degree angle to the first, the number of worlds where it got through would outnumber the number it didn't by 3 to 1. So just looking at light passing through a polarizer or two, there are quite a few world splits in such stories, as quite a few photons would be involved. But in such stories, the number of worlds never runs out because it's infinite, or such a big amount that it could be considered infinite, in the sense that running out of worlds would never be a consideration. I should say that different versions of a multiple world type account can have different answers to answer the question. Another answer could just be to still use the probability value, as you would a probability, but call it something else, and say it doesn't represent a probability, but something else, and just give a name to it. My point is that although spooky action at a distance hasn't been established, I don't think scientific discovery has been in line with what one would expect if it was a physical reality, as many atheists believe. Because I don't think Einstein or most atheists in the 19th or early 20th century thought they were going to have to claim a multiple world type account if they still wished to cling on to the idea that reality was a physical one, in which there wasn't spooky action at a distance. And then there was the fine-tuning of the physics constants that I mentioned in our discussion about my belief. I used it to help explain what fine-tuning was. I mentioned that atoms are made up of electrons and up quarks and down quarks, and that apparently, if you were to randomly choose the masses for those from between 0 up to the mass of a top quark, then there would be less than a 1 in 5 trillion chance of picking masses which would allow for complex chemistry. And those aren't the only constants that appear fine-tuned, making it much less likely than a 1 in 5 trillion chance if you were going to choose random numbers for all the constants. And I don't think that discovery would have been expected by atheists in the 19th century. But as I mentioned, there is the multiverse idea to explain this. The idea is based on what is called M-theory. As I understand it, M-theory is an approach to finding a unified theory. The speculation is that apart from the 4 dimensions of spacetime, there are another 7 dimensions which are folded up, creating an internal space that cannot be directly observed. And the idea is that it is the way these dimensions are folded up that determines the physical constants. As I understand it, there is not yet a complete mathematical formulation of M-theory, and there is no evidence to date that it would accommodate dimensional foldings that would give rise to a description of the laws of physics as observed. But why the multiple universes, you might ask? Well, it would have been simple if it had turned out that the theory only allowed for one way for the internal space to be folded, and that folding explained the observable laws of physics. But as I understand it, that isn't the way it turned out. There are various parameters for the potential foldings, such as the size of the dimensions, the number of holes in them, and so on. And some predict particles that we do not observe, or are simply unstable. As I understand it, if we avoid those undesirable foldings, there seem to be about 10 to the power of 500 different ways for how the internal space can be folded. And just to get an idea of how big a number, 1 followed by 500 zeros is, even if the theorists managed to evaluate what laws a particular folding would predict in 1,000th of a second, and had started working on it at the Big Bang, they would have only evaluated about 10 to the power of 20 of them, meaning that they would have to do that another 10 to the power of 480 times before they evaluated all of them. Therefore, it isn't surprising that the scientists haven't worked through all the possibilities in order to work out how many would allow for complex chemistry. Now, it could be the case that a formulation of M-theory could provide a unified theory, but that wouldn't help with the fine-tuning issue, which is a motivation for having a multiverse. And I'll just give a rough outline of 2 different types of story for the claim. One approach suggests that during the inflation period of the Big Bang, different parts of space underwent different amounts of inflation.
Would you mind just quickly explaining what you mean by the inflation period of the Big Bang?
Not at all. The idea is that the universe got 1,000 trillion quadrillion times bigger. That's a 1 with 30 zeros after it, in 10 million trillion quadrillion tenths of a second, which is like a 1 centimeter diameter coin suddenly blowing up to 10 million times the width of the Milky Way. As I understand it, the idea of inflation is supported by evidence. This version of the multiverse, though, adds the idea that the inflation that there is evidence for was just the inflation in our patch of the universe. That other patches of the universe had inflation periods which could have been shorter or are still happening. With this type of approach, the number of possible foldings of the internal space is just a list of all the possible outcomes from an inflationary period. That it is what happens during the inflation that determines what that patch will look like. The idea then being that the other patches are not observable, because inflation has separated us from them by distances much larger than the size of the observable universe, and due to the continual expansion, light from these other universes will never reach us. The other type of explanation is connected to the Everett multiple world interpretation type idea, in which all quantum possibilities are supposed to have really happened. With this multiverse interpretation, it is claimed that at the Big Bang, all those 10 to the power of 500 foldings of internal space happened. But the reason that we don't observe them isn't that they happened in different patches of the universe. Instead, they are in different worlds, in the same way that different quantum events outcomes are in different worlds. Both stories use the multiple potential foldings allowed in M-theory to resolve what seemed to be a fine-tuning issue regarding why the physics constants were such that they allowed for complex chemistry. Anyway, like with the spooky action at a distance result, I don't think Einstein or most atheists in the 19th or 20th century would have expected, in order to cling on to a belief in a physical universe, to believe that the physics constants we see aren't the only versions of those physics constants in the universe, and that they can have different values in different parts of the universe, whether the story is that those parts are different patches or different worlds or whatever else might be imagined. But I hope I've made it clear that I'm not using either the spooky action at a distance issue or the fine-tuning of the physics constants issue in my argument for a belief in God, because as I've just made clear, both of those can be countered by invoking a multi-world or multiverse type idea. What I have just been trying to indicate in this discussion is how historically there had been points in history when the prevalent religious understandings had appeared to be at odds with scientific discovery, and how the Ash experiment showed how people could be influenced by their peers. I think had the history have been different, and religious understanding been slightly different, then I think atheists might well have been pretty rare, if not absent in academic circles.
Do you think it would have made any difference to humanity?
Yes, I think it could have.
Well, I think we're out of time this week. But would you mind coming back and joining us again and sharing your thoughts on how you think it could have?
No, not at all. I'd be happy to.
Well, listeners, that's it then for our afternoon chat. I hope you all enjoyed it and will join us for the next one.